Welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at the spin room as we continue our coverage of the Kamala Harris-Donald Trump debate. It was a busy night. I've got a lot to ask. I have a panel standing by. Melanie Mason is a senior political writer at Politico. Rich Rubino is a political analyst and author. Melanie, Rich, it's good to see you guys. Thanks for coming on. In the debate's opening segment, Trump said everyone knows Kamala is a Marxist and that Biden's administration has destroyed our country with policies that are insane because they have to hate our country. During that, Harris alternated among smiling, shaking her head, and looking perplexed. Guys, mics were muted because they didn't want people to interrupt each other, but opposing candidates' facial expressions were front and center. Were they not, Melanie?
Oh, this was absolutely a split screen debate all the way through. And I couldn't help but contrast it to the debate between Biden and Trump, when the split screen really did not benefit President Biden. When he wasn't talking, sort of looked off camera and looked a little bit dazed and confused, which I think fed into the overall sense that he wasn't in control of that debate. And you're right, Vice President Harris was very expressive. I think that we could read a whole story in her face. But because of that, it meant that she kept herself very much a character, even when the former president was speaking. And I think that in that way, it actually did benefit her in a sense, and that she was very much an active participant in the debate, even when the question wasn't directed towards her. She also just seemed to be more aware that there was going to be a camera on her and kind of modulated her facial expressions for a split screen, maybe even more so than the former president did.
Are the facial expressions going to be one of the things we remember most about this debate, Rich, or is the SNL skit writing itself at this point?
Yes, absolutely. I kept thinking back to 2000 when Al Gore would sigh. And there was one point with George W. Bush. Remember in that debate, he kind of walked up to him and he got kind of close, and George W. Bush kind of looked and went like that. And at that point, a lot of people thought that George W. Bush had really benefited from that. But she obviously, look, she had spent 5 days in seclusion, basically in Pittsburgh, preparing. And I think that by the time, I think that she was very well prepared, to the extent that to the extent that she was very good in terms of what her kind of facial what her facials were going to be. And I think that for that reason, I think she did very well in that respect.
A live look at the spin room. After a Trump answer on abortion, when he accused Democrats of being radical and supporting abortion after birth, moderator Lindsay Davis says there's no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born. Did you notice that the moderators were doing more fact-checking at this debate compared to the CNN debate in June, Melanie?
Yes, absolutely. And I know that that's something that has really gotten under the skin, particularly of Trump supporters of Republicans, as they felt that there was sort of a lopsidedness to where the fact checking was coming from. And I do think that there might be something to that. I mean, I think that there were instances where the moderators could have pressed the vice president, particularly for not answering questions directly as they were posed to her. She would sort of take a question and use that as a springboard to answer whatever answer she wanted to do. But we did see a lot more assertive fact checking from the moderators to former President Trump on various issues, whether it was abortion or the question about whether Haitian immigrants are eating pets in Springfield, Ohio, which turned, I think, into one of the more viral moments of the debate. The moderators were much more willing to make themselves part of the exchange than we've seen in past debates.
You know, David Muir pushed Trump on whether he thought he actually won the 2020 election. Trump confirmed that he, in fact, does not believe that Biden won the election. I'm curious, Rich, what do Republicans largely think about that kind of talk? You and I talked during both conventions, and then something we noticed about the Republican National Convention, save for a little bit of a moment when Trump talked about the election being rigged. For the most part, we didn't hear many of those speakers at the RNC speaking about election denial. Is this a point that they're trying to make, to not bring up the election denial angle to this? And what do you make of Trump and his response to that earlier today?
Yes, I think you saw that on issues such as abortion, for example, where he's tried to moderate himself in terms of talking about his position on Amendment 4 that would enshrine abortion rights in the Florida Constitution, where he's a registered voter. It's very interesting. I think in the case of the Republicans, they had it's twofold. On the one hand, you have to animate the base. The base is very animated for Donald Trump. 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump in 2020. My guess is the number is going to be very similar in 2024. But on the other hand, you do have to reach those what are literally tens of thousands of voters in those critical swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and the rest. He has to reach those voters, and in order to do that, he has to appear to have a more moderate center-right type of a message, and it's very hard for him sometimes to try to explain that. But I think, though, that I think that specifically when you're talking about election denialism, that is something that really does galvanize the base. Now, how many people that are conservatives actually believe that the election was stolen, I don't know. But people, at least if you're in a conservative circles, generally speaking, you at least feign that you believe that.
Melanie, what's the latest reporting on whether or not we'll see any future debates? Is this going to be the only time that we see these two face-to-face?
Well, we know that Vice President Harris's team wants another debate. They came right out of the gate as soon as the debate was over saying, sign us up. We want to see another one. And in fact, we've seen a lot of her staffers, a lot of her aides on Twitter or on X right now talking about how they'd very much like to see a rematch. I think the real question is what we're going to hear from President Trump. And we have heard some grousing from folks that they felt that this was an unfairly moderated debate. I think it's going to maybe take a little bit of time for them to see, maybe to digest whether they think that it would be beneficial for President Trump or not to go out there again. But at this point, the ball is in his court. We have heard from Vice President Harris now that they are interested in a rematch. If I were a betting person, I'm not so sure that I would predict to see them on the stage again. But, I think a lot of it has to do with what we're going to be seeing in the polling in the next couple of weeks. I mean, we are closing into the real crunch time on the campaign. And I think we'll have a real insight into where the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign feel the momentum is going, depending on what they want to do with a potential second debate.
Brian Fallon is a Harris campaign advisor. That was fun. Let's do it again in October, he says. Of course, we'll be watching the vice presidential debate. That's going to be on CBS News on October 1st. I'll get to that in a moment. But Rich, does it feel like either candidate would benefit from a second debate?
Theoretically, the candidate that's down is the one that benefits from the debate. That's why, for example, in 1976, the incumbent President Gerald Ford was down by 33 points, challenged President Carter to 3 debates. They had debates, and Ford almost caught up. But in this case, you have a scenario where you have a former president and a current vice president, and the election is basically a draw. What does that mean? That means that essentially a debate would probably have very little actual impact on either side. The American people are so bifurcated on one side or the other that I think that generally speaking, I don't think a debate would have that much of an effect, unless you have a scenario where one candidate absolutely crucifies the other candidate and absolutely has an all-out victory against the other candidate. But even if that's the case, you're still talking about very few voters at the margins that are actually persuadable centrist voters.
Byron Donalds, the representative out of Florida, a Trump supporter, is in the spin room. If you guys will, please stand by. I want to listen to him live.
And these endowments, they got massive endowments, but they keep raising tuition. Here's the third part, and this is not Donald Trump. This is Byron Donalds talking. I'm not talking in this third one on behalf of President Trump. I'm talking on behalf of him. When you subsidize student loans, unlimited student loans, that doesn't help colleges and universities lower costs. It only incentivizes them to raise costs because they know the money is coming regardless. We need to really look at that. That's my opinion. That's my view. So I think that's how you deal with college affordability in the long term.
Sir, how would you address the concerns that Trump's proposal for a 20% tax across the board would pass those costs along to the American consumer?
What do you mean? Explain that. Expound upon it. 20% tax across the board.
Something he mentioned in the debate.
Yes, his tariff proposal, sir.
Okay, so first of all, the tariff proposal deals with making sure that you're holding other countries accountable if they're not fair and equitable in their trade deals with us. If they're not going to be equitable in our trade deals with us, and there is no stick, i.e. tariffs, then they're going to continue to manipulate it, and that's to the detriment of the American people. The other thing I will say about tariff policy is, and he also said this as well, if the tariff policy is so bad, how come Kamala Harris hasn't gotten rid of it? They have not. They have kept Donald Trump's tariff policy. He also talked about energy. He said they were moving towards this crazy Green New Deal stuff until the prices of oil started going up massively. And what did they start doing? Slowly reverse course, very quietly, back to some of Trump's policies because that was working for the American people, for the American consumers. That's my answer to you.
What do you think of Trump showing up tonight? And what do you think of the criticism that says he lost the debate tonight because he showed up was in the spin room? Yeah, that's what Democrats are saying.
Democrats will say a lot of things that aren't true. I mean, but that's surprise, surprise. First of all, Donald Trump has never been afraid of talking to any reporter, anywhere, anytime, any place. Once again, proven tonight by coming to the spin room. That's number one. Number two, and more importantly, The Democrats are looking for a victory no matter what, because the reality is their agenda has been disastrous for the American people. Their policies have been disastrous. People have fallen behind. Listen, I was out in Philadelphia today talking to voters. They've fallen behind. They have. That's on Kamala Harris's record. When Donald Trump was president, we were successful. When he's president again, we're going to be successful again. Coming to the spin room, that's totally fine as far as I'm concerned. It once again proves he's not afraid to talk directly to the people.
You mentioned Philadelphia. There's a dead heat for the White House in Pennsylvania.
Excuse me?
A dead heat for the White House in Pennsylvania, meaning that Trump and Harris are tied. How does he move the needle in Pennsylvania, this key state?
That's just going to be on-the-ground campaigning. Obviously, I think we're going to be in Pennsylvania a lot through the next 50 days or so. Look, I think for Pennsylvania, it's one about turning out voters. It's two about just having your message, which has been consistent really for 9 years, not just this campaign, about doing everything possible to put the American people first, having a strong economy, having strong borders. I think what we're seeing right now, especially with now Kamala Harris as the opponent, what are her solutions and ideas? I didn't hear any tonight. I heard a lot of attacks, a lot of personal attacks from Kamala Harris tonight. But I didn't hear concrete ideas about how she was going to actually positively impact the lives of the American people. And what expounds upon that is the first question in this debate. Are people better off than they were 4 years ago? She sidestepped that question. She dodged it. She would not answer that question. Because the truth is, her agenda, her economic policies with Joe Biden have been a disaster for the American people, and they are not better off today, especially in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Byron Donalds in the spin room. He talked about the first question that was asked. And Melanie, I want to ask you about the first question. Obviously, David Muir asking if people are better off now than they were 4 years ago. How did Kamala sound straight out of the gate?
I thought she sounded quite nervous right out of the gate, actually. I think that it seemed like it took her a little bit of a couple of questions to get into the groove. And I think it was pretty notable that she didn't directly answer that question. I think she pivoted to what she wants to do as her economic agenda going forward. But I think that what we didn't hear was a very robust defense of the Biden-Harris administration. I think that what we saw in that answer, and then I think overall in this debate, is that the vice president, when she was talking about either her record as vice president or what she would like to do as president, the answers were, I would say, good, fine. I think that there were points where there was a little bit of vagueness. There was an opportunity perhaps to press for more specifics. Where we really saw her debate strategy, however, was when she was on offense, when she was basically baiting Donald Trump to answer questions on her own terms, to respond to things that were clearly meant to get under his skin. And I think that where we saw the turn, I think, in the tide from maybe her initial nervousness, her initial sort of vague answers, was in that third question when we were talking about abortion, and you saw her really turn that from where she stands on abortion. That was clearly a big part of it, but she was going after the former president about what his stances were, what happened under his administration with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I think that was where you saw Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, come through, and that was, I think, her stronger moments in the debate.
Rich, how did Trump sound straight out of the gate?
He sounded bad. Actually, at the beginning, I thought he was very good when he was talking about the economy. Later on, when he talked about the tariffs, I think it was when he got rattled was when he was specifically when they talked about immigration. And I think he started talking about the possibility that Springfield, Ohio, that there were actually migrants that had eaten pets, and he kind of went off the reservation in that respect. Generally speaking, when he sticks to issues, he can be very good at that. Now, that being said, I think it's very interesting that he did talk, that you have this scenario now that just talks about politics as a constant realigning. You have the scenario from 1952 with Eisenhower all the way through 2012 with Mitt Romney. Every solitary Republican was basically for free trade. It was a Republican Party that got NAFTA through the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate back in 1993. Now you have Congressman Byron Donalds talking about this, and Donald Trump being an advocate for protective tariffs, making someone like Vice President Harris now having to move to the right, and the Democrats having to move to the right and talking about criticisms of tariffs. J.D. Vance talked about how bad NAFTA was at the Republican National Convention. It's just a really interesting realignment that we're seeing in American politics. And I think that's part of the legacy that we're going to see of the Trump presidency, whether it's immigration, whether it's foreign policy, or whether it's trade. basically the Republicans have taken the position that the Democrats used to take. And now you have this scenario where Vice President Harris is starring the endorsement of former Republican Vice President Dick Cheney. Go back to 2004, 2005, 2006. He was the absolute political antichrist for people on the left side of the political spectrum. Now, who would ever would have thought of back in 2005 that now you would have him being starred by Vice President Harris?
I got to ask you, and Byron Donalds even referred to it as the spin room. Spin room isn't exactly the most enduring name, you guys. How has that name stuck? I mean, it basically means that what's going to be said in here isn't exactly going to be truthful. Rich, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's what you do in America. It's what you do in American politics. You hear a message and you immediately give the propaganda side, and that propaganda side is going to be why you think that candidate did better than the other candidates. I remember going back in 1992 when, for example, Al Gore and Dan Quayle were debating Admiral James Stockdale. And I think most people that were watching thought that James Stockdale did perform very poorly, but there was his advocates right there talking about how well he didn't sound like a politician, something to that effect. You really wonder how many people that are in that have had some sort of media training, because they know what to do, they know how to talk, and one thing they do know how to do is how to pivot. If they're asked a question, and he saw this with Congressman Donalds, he tries to answer it in 2 or 3 sentences, then pivot to something else, to another topic. And I think that members of the media do that sometimes too.
I want to get back to the policy here. Melanie, you wrote a piece during the DNC in Chicago analyzing how Democrats are talking about immigration this cycle, specifically how Harris is getting leeway from the left to talk tougher on the border. How did she toe that line tonight?
She talked about the border security bill that she and President Biden had endorsed. This was this bipartisan border security package that was negotiated in the Senate. And this really broke decades of Democratic orthodoxy, in that what we used to hear from Democrats was that if there was going to be an increase in border security measures, it would have to be coupled with some sort of legalization or liberalizing of American immigration policies, whether that was comprehensive immigration reform, like a pathway to citizenship, relief for the dreamers, ways to basically, I think, appease the more left part of their flank that wants to see a path to citizenship for people who are living in this country without documentation. Democrats dispense with that. They realize that I think that immigration right now is a losing issue for them, and border security is something that is very popular, not just with Republican voters, but with independents, with people across the spectrum, even with Latino voters. We're seeing in polls that majority of Latinos want to see some form of border security. That's a real paradigm shift. So the fact that she was going after former President Trump for blocking a border security bill, basically trying to outflank him on the right on an issue that he is typically seen as kind of his bread and butter and has performed stronger in the polls, I think tells you a lot about how the immigration debate overall has shifted to the right in the last 8 years, since Donald Trump has really remade the issue on the political scene. And I think how Democrats have sort of accepted, I think mostly driven by fear of a second Donald Trump presidency, that yes, I talked to people who are on the more left side of the Democratic Party. They don't love this focus on border security at the expense of talking about legalization, but they're willing to accept it because they think of a potential second Trump presidency as being so terrifying that they're willing to take some rhetoric that they otherwise wouldn't love.
I want to listen into a little bit of Harris speaking about Trump's playbook and about Project 2025. Let's play this out.
Let's talk about what Donald Trump left us. Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Donald Trump left us the worst public health epidemic in a century. Donald Trump left us the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. And what we have done is clean up Donald Trump's mess. What we have done and what I intend to do is build on what we know are the aspirations and the hopes of the American people. But I'm going to tell you all in this debate tonight, you're going to hear from the same old tired playbook, a bunch of lies, grievances, and name calling. What you're going to hear tonight is a detailed and dangerous plan called Project 2025 that the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again. I believe very strongly that the American people want a president who understands the importance of bringing us together, knowing we have so much more in common than what separates us, and I pledge to you to be a president for all Americans. What we
Okay, I do want to ask you guys a little bit about that, but first we hear Marco Rubio is in the spin room. Let's listen into the senator out of Florida.
Algunos han llegado hasta acá y el punto que quiere decir es que estos países están expulsando hasta cierto punto los elementos más peligrosos entre las personas.
Pierce, you may be giving an answer in Spanish right now. If we hear any more from Senator Rubio, we'll bring that to you a little bit later on in the evening. But, you know, I wanted to say, while we were talking about Harris's strategy when it comes to Trump and talking about his threat, the New York Times said that Harris's debate prep did not focus on portraying Trump as a threat to democracy. Why might the Harris team want to lose that part of their rhetoric, Rich?
Public. When you look at polls, it's the first issue is always the economy. Then you go into issues like immigration, and very far below that is the idea of whether Trump is a threat to democracy. It's not a kitchen table issue, if you will. Now, that being said, Vice President Harris and her coefficients have really been brilliant in terms of making it so that the word Project 2025 is become a household word. Usually something that's that kind of intellectual, you don't want to bring up because it's something that kind of goes over their heads. I mean, no one's they're going to say, what is this? And certainly no one's going to, very few people, that is, except maybe some policy wonks, who can actually read all 900 pages of it. But you have a scenario now where polls are showing that a majority of the American people actually know what Project 2025 is. That being said, I don't know if it's necessarily sagacious to put it in advertisements, because again, I don't think it's necessarily going to be a voting issue the way, for example, trade is, the way, for example, the economy in general is.
I gotta ask you guys, do you miss the audiences being at these debates, Melanie?
You know, the only time that I missed them was at the very beginning when they walked on, and it just felt as they were both walking on in that silence, and there was this weird standoff of will there be a handshake or not? Like, you felt the silence, right? It did feel like just a little awkward. But I think for the most part, the lack of an audience, I actually think it meant that you're able to move along, cover a lot of ground. I mean, obviously, it changes the dynamics quite a bit if there's an audience that's friendlier for one side or the other. And the truth is that it makes it much more of a sort of entertainment aspect of it. But if we really are trying to see how these two candidates handle getting these questions thrown at them, the lack of an audience, I think, just really puts the focus just on those two folks on the debate stage, and of course, the moderators. So awkward handshake aside, I think that it was probably better just in terms of the amount of territory that could be covered. We can talk about all the things that weren't discussed because there's still so many issues, I think, that are relevant to this presidential contests that weren't able to be fit in this 90-minute plus debate. Just think of how many fewer issues could have come up if we had to wait for cheering or jeers or what have you from an audience.
What felt like was missing from tonight?
Oh, well, there was no discussion, for example, about gun policy, other than her very briefly talking about her being a gun owner and former President Trump talking about how Harris would confiscate guns. I mean, we just had another mass shooting at a high school in Georgia. And I do think it's pretty remarkable that we did not have a long conversation about gun safety, gun policy in this country. Healthcare was kind of constrained to a couple of minutes at the very end. I mean, that was the driving issue when we're thinking about, for example, the 2020 Democratic primary. A lot of those issues that Harris staked a position pretty far to the left in the Democratic primary in 2020 got very little airtime, if any at all, tonight. So look, I mean, this is not a knock on the moderators. There's a lot of ground to cover. And also, I do think that they let some exchanges breathe. We actually got to see some back and forth between the two of them. And that tells us just as much about these two individuals and how they're handling these high stress situations. But if you're running down a list of issues, to me, one of the big standouts was guns. That's such a pressing issue in this country, just as recently as last week, this horrific shooting at this high school. And yet we weren't really seeing a robust conversation about where we go on guns.
Rich, what was missing?
A couple of things. One of them would be, and I would ask this question, what as president would you do to try to boost the economies of Central American nations where the migrants are coming from so that they won't necessarily have to actually go to the Mexican-American border? In other words, what would you do to bring jobs to places like El Salvador, like Honduras? Because that's kind of the root cause of why people are coming, why migrants are coming. The other thing is the national debt. it's really become a sleeper issue, which is really kind of amazing when you think about the fact that the national debt stands over $30 trillion, and it's something that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have failed to even get to the national debt. It reminds, I think the last time the budget was actually balanced was back in 1998 when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich worked together on a balanced budget deal, 97 rather. But I think if that's something, it's kind of the sleeping giant of American politics is, what are you going to do about the national debt? Because it's kind of the silent killer, and it's the silent tax increase as well.
You know, we are 56 days away from Election Day. I don't need to tell either of you guys that this is a hell of a lot of time in politics speak. How short are voters' memories? Will tonight's debate be out of sight, out of mind come November, Melanie?
Probably. We do live in such a rapid news environment that the truth is that things that feel like major news events one day seem to be out of the ether pretty quickly. I mean, the former president, there was an assassination attempt against him just a few months ago, and that seems to be something that is very so far in the rearview mirror now. I actually think that the thing that happened tonight that may have bigger bearing on voters in November is the Taylor Swift endorsement that came just after the end of the debate. And I'm not even being facetious here. This is obviously the biggest pop star in the world, and not only was she talking about what her presidential preference was, but she was encouraging her followers to register to vote. We have seen in situations where she does link to voter registration in certain elections that there is a spike. And I think that both candidates, but particularly the Democrats, ever since there's been this switch at the top of the ticket, there has been a big change in the enthusiasm. Democrats were lagging so much in the enthusiasm gap behind Republicans, and we've seen Kamala Harris really close that gap since taking over the top of the ticket. And I think looking at people like who are Taylor Swift fans, probably on the younger side, a lot of women. I mean, these are people that Democrats see as their core voters, and they really, really want to make sure that they're enthusiastic and able to vote. The fact she signed that her post childless cat lady, which is certainly a dig at what vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance had said about women who don't have children. I think that just sharpens even more this contrast. I think we're going to see an unprecedented gender gap when it comes to voters this fall. And I think things like the Taylor Swift endorsement just feed into this even more, the sense that women voters feel pretty targeted by, I think, some of the rhetoric that they're hearing from the Republican ticket. You have the biggest pop star in the world echoing that. And I think that that's going to have more durability than anything that was said on the debate stage tonight.
Not much of a punch. Do celebrity voices pack, Rich? This is something you and I talked about during the DNC.
Yes, absolutely. Generally speakingly, it's de minimis. I mean, how many people say, well, I'm going to vote for this person for president because my cemetery commissioner or my attorney general or my lieutenant governor supports a certain person? Usually it's irrelevant. That being said, this may be one of the ones that's actually relevant. In history, you can go back to 1976 after Gerald Ford had won 6 Republican primaries. Jesse Helms in the North Carolina primary ended up endorsing Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan ended up winning a couple more states. After that, became relevant, and by 1980 became the Republican presidential candidate, in part because he was seen as relevant. The other would be when Jim Clyburn endorsed Joe Biden back in 2020 after he had lost Iowa, he had lost New Hampshire, he had lost Nevada. Very crucial. You know, this could be someone that's very crucial in part because she brings out low propensity voters. Voters are not very interested in the body politics and aren't interested in politics, but they're interested in her. Maybe they'll then go to the website for Vice President Harris to say, look, I like the child care plan, something to that effect. So I think this might be in the realm of Jesse Helms and in the realm of Congressman Clyburn.
I want to play another highlight from tonight. Let's watch.
Could just get a yes or no, because your running mate, J.D. Vance, has said that you would veto it if it did come to your desk.
Well, I didn't discuss it with J.D. In all fairness, J.D., and I don't mind if he has a certain view, but I think he was speaking for me, but I really didn't. Look, we don't have to discuss it because she'd never be able to get it, just like she couldn't get student loans. They couldn't get student loans. They didn't even come close to getting student loans. They taunted young people and a lot of other people that had loans. they can never get this approved. So it doesn't matter what she says about going to Congress. So wonderful, let's go to Congress, do it. But the fact is that for years they wanted to get it out of Congress and out of the federal government, and we did something that everybody said couldn't be done. And now you have a vote of the people on abortion.
Vice President Harris, I want to give you your time to respond, but I do want to ask, would you support any restrictions on a woman's right to an abortion?
I absolutely support reinstating the protections of Roe v. Wade, and as you rightly mentioned, nowhere in America is a woman carrying a pregnancy to term and asking for an abortion. That is not happening. It's insulting to the women of America.
You know, a lot's been made from both camps that the other camp has been flip-flopping on a number of issues. Specifically, the abortion issue has been charged against the Trump camp. I got to ask, when we talk about candidates in a primary, sometimes they go somewhat to the more extreme sides of their party. And then it is somewhat normal for candidates to move more center during the general election. Could that be one of the reasons that explains why we're seeing flip-flopping taking place, Rich?
Yeah, and I think that you do see that, and certainly Vice President Harris, if you go back to 2019, she had to contend with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren running in that primary, and they were unreserved liberals. They weren't trying to moderate themselves whatsoever. So Vice President Harris did not see any sort of a movement on the right where she could try to run as the most conservative Democrat. So what did she do? She tries to run, she tries to compete with them. She never actually went anywhere because the liberal voters saw her as a prosecutor. There was a whole meme that came out that Kamala the cop. So she never actually went anywhere because of that. But the fact of the matter is that she did have to move to the left for that primary. And generally speaking, Joe Biden did the same thing back in 2020. He had to move far to the left to try to compete with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren as well. But in the general election, you try to move yourself closer to the center. One exception to that will be John McCain. When John McCain was running in 2008, he garnered a lot of support, especially in New Hampshire, from Democrats and from disgruntled Democrats and some independents in the New Hampshire primary, and up until the Republican convention, he was seen as kind of a moderate candidate. But then in the general election, he had to move further to the right because there was a lot of members of his base that were so aggravated that he was the nominee. So accordingly, he ended up choosing Sarah Palin, a very conservative governor of Alaska, as his running mate. But that being said, flip-flops has always been a part of American politics, and reinventions, whether it's Richard Nixon, whether it's Jerry Brown, politicians tend to reinvent themselves, and usually the American people do not hold it against them that they have changed a position. I remember when Mitt Romney was running against Barack Obama, and the Obama campaign was saying, should we try to make Mitt Romney have to be a flip-flopper because he's changed his views on abortion, he's changed his views on a litany of issues. He once said, for example, that I'm not going back to Reagan Bush, and he was critical in the past, and the advice was don't go after him for flip-flopping. It's better to go after someone for an extremist, because if you go after someone for flip-flopping, someone in the Senate is going to say, well, he never believed all the liberal rhetoric, or he never believed all that Republican rhetoric in the first place. So it's sometimes politicians can get away with flip-flopping because it makes them seem more moderate.
Yep, and the charge of flip-flopping has come from both camps. As I said, Trump's camp has underscored shifts in Vice President Harris's stance on fracking, healthcare, and immigration. Meanwhile, Harris has criticized Trump's stance on abortion and marijuana legislation. We are going to head out in a sec here, guys. I want to ask about one more thing. Tim Walz was in the battleground state of Arizona today. He'll be debating J.D. Vance on October 1st in New York City. That's going to be on CBS News. What do he and Vance need to prove when they face off in about 3 weeks, Melanie?
In some ways, both of them just need to have a do no harm debate, right? I mean, very few people cast a vote based on who the vice president is. And so I think both of them have to sort of, their aim is to kind of make no news, or at least to not do anything that would embarrass their running mate. But I do think that the dynamic between the two is going to be fascinating, because in some ways they have so much in common, in the sense that they both are from the Midwest. They say that they can sort of speak to the same voters, but they could not be more different in terms of political style. And so I think that you have, in some ways, these like photo negative images of each other. And that the fact that there are so many similarities may mean that it's actually maybe a touchier, maybe a slightly more pointed debate, because they both are going to say, you know, you claim to be from the Midwest, you claim to have these Midwestern values, but you're not reflective of the values that I hold or that my community holds. But I think that both of them probably want to get out of there, maybe landing a few zingers. But if you're a huge headline out of a vice presidential debate, it probably means that something went wrong and that you're not doing a service to your ticket. You want to be a do no harm vice presidential candidate.
Rich, what's the next chapter? What are we looking ahead to next? Is it that debate on October 1st?
Yeah, but I think generally speakingly, vice presidential debates are forgotten. There are few that are remembered, and it's interesting what was just said. I think that probably the most relevant was 1988 when after Dan Quayle started talking about comparing, saying I had more experience than Jack Kennedy did at this point. When Lloyd Benson looked and said, "Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. I served with Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine, and Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." That was probably the one time a vice presidential debate was really relevant. And it didn't really make much of a difference in the end game. People were voting for either Mike Dukakis or George H.W. Bush. So I think it's going to be a one-day story. But one thing Tim Walz, I think, will try to do, he needs to be a conduit. And this might have been why he was picked over Governor Shapiro and over Governor Andy Beshear, is that he can be a conduit to red America, to folks living in places like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, more conservative parts of those states, because he is a hunter. He's someone that comes from that background, former high school football coach. He doesn't necessarily fit the profile of a liberal Democrat. Now, Republicans are trying to make him that way, but he's someone who represented a relatively moderate to conservative congressional district in Minnesota, someone who came from the Nebraska prairie. So I think that's basically his message. In J.D. Vance's case, he, I think, has to try to make the case that he's not as conservative or as unorthodox and it's more heterodox as many are trying to make him out to be. So it could just be a conversation like Joe Lieberman and Dick Cheney had back in 2000, which never really amounted in much ammunition on either side.
Melanie, we'll end it with you. What's the next big chapter in this election? If it's not going to be the Trump sentencing, which is now happening after the race, is it going to be the vice presidential debate? Is it going to be something else? What say you?
I mean, I do think that that's the next big thing on the calendar, unless we see a second presidential debate. But to me, I think the next big tipping point is when ballots start going out, which is actually quite soon. I mean, I'm here in California, where our mail ballots are going to start a full month before Election Day. And I believe that in swing states and places like Pennsylvania, that is also going to be the case. So the voting is going to be starting imminently. And so I think as we are looking at the calendar, that also means there's a narrowing window for the candidates to change the trajectory of the race. And so what we've seen is obviously an asteroid hit this race in the summer, which really did change the trajectory. And we're now trying to see in some of the polling, there seems to be a little bit of a reversion back to Donald Trump in some of this polling, but it is really a jump ball race. So for 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so before ballots do start going out, these candidates are going to be grinding it out every day to try and recapture the momentum because they just don't have that much time.
Yep.
Good to see you, Rich. Good to see you, Melanie. Have a good night.
Good to see you too, Austin.
Thanks.
Let's let away for a quick break. More coverage in 2 minutes.